Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the latest in our series of Center for Transportation webinars. Every year, monitors and tracks the major transportation ballot measures in the run-up to the November election, and this year is certainly no exception. There are several major ballot measures across the country, and among those is Measure RR in the Bay Area. If approved, this sales tax measure would provide a dedicated revenue source to fund CalTrain service and equity investments to improve the system's accessibility and affordability. Today, we'll be discussing and hearing more about the measure from Seamus Murphy and Adina Levin. Seamus is the Chief Communications Officer for Samtrans, CalTrain, and the San Mateo County Transportation Authority, where he oversees internal and external communications to all relevant audiences, including agency employees, customers, media, local communities, and public officials at all levels of government. Adina is Executive Director and co-founder of Friends of CalTrain, which supports successful modernization of CalTrain in the context of an integrated system of sustainable transportation. She's also the Advocacy Director for Seamless Bay Area, which provides education advocacy to bring about a seamlessly integrated transit system. Today, Seamus will provide an overview of the measure and detail how CalTrain would utilize the revenue stream if approved, and Adina will discuss advocacy efforts around the measure and how advocacy efforts are have evolved and are being influenced during the time of COVID-19. As a reminder and a disclaimer, does not endorse specific ballot measures, but the focus of these webinars is to talk through the history and details of these measures and provide all of you watching a chance to ask questions and get some local context on how regions across the country are going forward with these initiatives during the pandemic. We'll have plenty of time for questions at the end, and you can put your questions into the questions box in your control panel on the side of your screen, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end. And with that, I will hand it over to Seamus.
Thanks, Ramik. Very excited to be a part of this presentation and to share a little bit about what the CalTrain ballot measure would do for our system and some of the context around how this measure actually made it to the ballot. If we go to the slides, go ahead and run through those. I think they provide some important context here. You hear a phone ringing in the background. The CalTrain corridor is one of the largest commuter rail systems in the country. We've grown our ridership steadily over the last 10 years or so and become the 7th largest commuter rail system. Also the most efficient commuter rail system by a large stretch. You can see the cost in terms of subsidy that it requires to carry a passenger on CalTrain versus your typical Bay Area transit system. There's a really stark difference there. Part of that is that our system really has outlived its useful life in terms of our equipment. All of our equipment needs to be upgraded. We're operating a diesel system that we're transitioning to an electrified system currently. There's a $2 billion project underway to make that happen. Our ridership has increased a lot, but we have not upgraded our corridor to reflect the increase in ridership. And if we go to the next slide, you can see that we really need to increase our capacity much more to accommodate the ridership demand that's coming. We know that when things return to normal, traffic is going to return to the Bay Area. In some cases, that's already happening. And under normal times, we were getting ready to need to accommodate a corridor that was going to have significantly more jobs and population around it. And without CalTrain capacity increases, that job and population growth would really turn into congestion that's unacceptable for the Bay Area as a region. The CalTrain is the best answer to addressing that congestion. And so our plans for expanding capacity were really geared towards addressing that congestion issue and accommodating growth. If we go to the next slide, you can see that this long-term plan for increasing our service is really an aggressive plan. Our board wanted us to really think boldly about increasing CalTrain service. We are currently operating that 5 train per peak hour per direction diesel service. When we move to electrification in 2022, we're going to be able to increase that peak hour service. We're going to be able to operate more frequent service. The number of trains per day would increase dramatically, and then phasing in even more expansion leading up to that 2040 vision, where we're operating 268 trains per day with room for a significant amount of high-speed rail service on the corridor. That's the ultimate goal, still is the ultimate goal for CalTrain in the future. Next slide, please. The problem is that CalTrain doesn't have the resources to make this expansion happen. In fact, we don't even have the resources under our current funding structure to operate even that baseline electrified service in 2022. CalTrain is highly fare dependent. We have a really high fare box return, but we do not have a guaranteed subsidy to cover the rest of our operating and stated good repair budgets on an annual basis. We have 3 member agencies that fund that subsidy. They make up the difference between fares and what's required to operate our service. But all of those member agencies really have CalTrain as a second priority. Their primary interest is to fund their bus and light rail services in Santa Clara County, San Mateo County, and San Francisco counties. And whatever is left over is available for CalTrain in good times, but in tough times, they cut the CalTrain subsidy back. And when one member agency cuts back, the other member agencies proportionally reduce their share of subsidy. And that creates a situation where CalTrain becomes even more fare dependent because the agency has historically increased fares to make up for that lost subsidy from member agencies. So we really tried to address this. If you go to the next slide, we decided that in order to move forward with this service vision and really provide more fiscal sustainability to our system as a whole, we needed to pass legislation. Senate Bill 797 was passed, and it authorizes us to put a measure on the ballot, a 1/8 cent, very modest sales tax on the ballot across all 3 counties. The measure would still need to pass by 2/3 of the voters across all 3 of those counties, not 2/3 in each individual county, but the total voting population across all 3 counties. The legislation specified that we weren't interfering with or impacting the 2% local sales tax limit that exists for jurisdictions in California. This would be separate from that, and it would create, most importantly, $108 million a year for us to be able to operate our current service, operate our modernized electrified service, and then expand that service in the future through a number of capital improvements. Next slide. And what this would really fund is that service increase that's in the yellow box. It doesn't get us to the full 2040 service vision, but it does allow us to increase our service from 92 trains a day to 204 trains a day. It allows us to provide really a more relevant service for the customer base on the peninsula. It allows us to increase capacity through that more frequent electrified expansion using that technology. If you go to the next slide, you can see that we're able to provide on the next slide, much more frequent service to just about every station that we serve today. That allows us to increase ridership and capacity to accommodate the growth and the ridership demand that we know is going to return when we are past the pandemic. There are a number of other benefits associated with this service expansion. If you go to the next slide, you'll see that we're able to increase capacity really significantly from 63,000 riders per day to over 100,000 riders per day. Next slide shows that the impact on that ridership increase is that it has on freeway congestion. CalTrain currently carries 4 freeway lanes worth of traffic. With this expansion, we can add another 2 lanes of freeway traffic, put those drivers onto CalTrain instead of on freeways. The next slide shows that we would be able to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and vehicle miles traveled by shifting people from single occupied vehicles onto CalTrain. And the next slide shows that that the challenge for putting this measure on the ballot is really a significant one. It's a significant one in normal times. It's even more difficult under pandemic conditions. As we discovered, we needed to get 7 agencies, including our board of directors, to approve putting this measure on the ballot across all 3 counties that CalTrain serves. And we were just about to launch the effort to do this. We had developed a very strong coalition of stakeholders that includes and really was spearheaded by Adina Levin, who you're going to hear from next. And just as we were about to do that, if you go to the next slide, the pandemic hit and our ridership plummeted, probably more significantly than a lot of other transit systems around the nation saw. We went down to just 5% of our pre-pandemic ridership. Pretty rapidly, we adjusted service to accommodate or to account for that ridership reduction. We're still now only very slightly ticking back up to around the 7% of normal ridership range, and we know that other systems were grappling with the same issues that you all are in terms of uncertainty around when ridership is going to return and what we might need to do to help encourage its return. If you go to the next slide, you know, the impact of the pandemic made us take a real stark, careful look at our budgets and options that we have for reducing costs. With a fixed cost system like CalTrain, we learned that there really aren't a lot of opportunities to significantly reduce costs. We can reduce our service to something that is really not relevant even for the 7% of our normal ridership for the essential workers and frontline workers that depend on our system. And we don't save all that much revenue. So we even looked at shutdown costs on the next slide. What would it take to shut down CalTrain if we needed to do that? The CARES Act funding that we've received really is only going to last us to the end of the calendar year in 2020. The ridership decrease that we've seen is costing CalTrain about $8 million a month in lost fare box revenue. So shutting down really became an option that we had to look seriously at. Without any external revenue to make up for those losses once CARES Act funding runs out, if we did shut down, we learned that there are still costs associated with that. We would need to continue to maintain our system for our tenant railroads that use it. There's an obligation that we have to do that. We carry freight rail on the CalTrain corridor, and so there are costs over the course of a year, over $60 million required to maintain the corridor to accommodate those tenant railroads, and then remobilizing, assuming that we would stay shut down for 12 months and then remobilize. There's a 12-month process associated with that, and it would cost us over $90 million to be able to fully remobilize, retrain, and prepare the corridor to relaunch service. So shutdown is also not a good affordable option. So it really made our sales tax push, our sales tax ballot measure, about saving CalTrain and as much as it is about expanding CalTrain service to meet the needs of the future. If you go to the next slide, we learned some positive news that riders do plan to return to our system. Our most frequent riders, 71% of them plan to ride as much or more than they did previously. Only 1% of riders in our current surveys have shown that they plan on not returning to transit at all. Employers are still working through what they might do in terms of welcoming people back to the office. That's an important consideration, but a lot of them, most of them, are planning for a phased-in return to the office by employees. Next slide. So in our efforts to resume our push to put this measure on the ballot, even given the pandemic conditions and the different priorities that our counties might have under this crisis, we did some polling and learned that that when it comes to the voters, saving CalTrain is really a message that resonated with them. We had good support prior to the pandemic. That support actually increased a little bit during the pandemic because of the challenges that CalTrain is facing, because of how important CalTrain is to addressing larger regional issues like traffic congestion that voters really told us they expected to return when the pandemic is over. Support did tick up a little bit. So we decided to move forward and push for this measure to be on the ballot. The next slide shows that we were successful in getting this measure on the ballot, and we wouldn't have been able to do that. I think there's one more slide if you want to advance that. We wouldn't have been able to do that if it wasn't for the strong coalition of support that we have spent the last couple of years building. And Adina Levin at Friends of CalTrain has been really instrumental in not just participating and contributing to the planning process for CalTrain's long-term service vision, but initiating the advocacy efforts that were needed to put this measure on the ballot. And I'm happy to turn it over to her now so she could talk a little bit more about those. Thank you. Dina, I think you're on mute.
Great. So that was a really great background from Seamus on how Measure RR came about, and I will tell backstory from the advocacy perspective. So Friends of CalTrain is a advocacy organization. We have about 8,000 or so participants on the CalTrain corridor from San Francisco through San Jose, and we've been working over the years supporting stable funding for CalTrain successful modernization in the context of a regionally integrated public transportation system that is accessible to everyone. So part of the advocacy that has built up to this has been about the vision for CalTrain, which has been for years a commuter rail that was focused on peak service, taking people with white-collar jobs to and from to work. And we did a fair amount of community education about the international regional rail model of service that is more frequent at all times of the day or week, as well as better integrated with the rest of the public transportation system and accessible to a wider range of riders. And that was something that the CalTrain as an organization studied, and the CalTrain board approved as part of the business plan service vision that Seamus talked about, with the intent of the funding to support those service improvements. One of the things that we had been advocating for quite a while, along with advocates in the Bay Area transit justice community, is for CalTrain to do an equity study. We had observed that there were disparities in terms of users of CalTrain and users of other parts of the public transportation system, and CalTrain did their own studies and showed that in fact there are disparities, and there's a set of things that CalTrain can do to address that and have the ridership of CalTrain to better reflect the community that it traverses, with things not only including means-based fares, which CalTrain has already taken a step to participate in the a new regional means-based fare program at a 50% discount, but also taking other measures with making its fare system more equitable. One of the things that CalTrain found was that an important equity measure is connectivity. Lower income people are much more likely to want to connect to a rail service via other local and regional transit, and therefore improving that connectivity between CalTrain service and the rest of the transit system is an equity measure. And the CalTrain board has recently approved that set of equity provisions and programs that would be funded by Measure RR. So that's some of the background that we had done on the advocacy front. In terms of the background on the funding, the work that we've been doing for Measure RR has a backstory and work that we had done with partners in a couple of different county ballot measures in the Bay Area, starting in 2014 with Measure B in Santa Clara County, and then even more so with Measure W, which was a 0.5-cent sales tax in San Mateo County. The three counties that CalTrain services are Santa Clara, San Mateo, and San Francisco. In 2018, there was a coalition of public transit advocacy, environmental transit justice groups that worked in a multi-stakeholder process that the multiple stakeholders also included the business community and various other community stakeholders to discuss what would go into the ballot measure. And when that ballot measure was something that the various different groups approved of, then the advocacy groups endorsed the measure and then worked with the official campaign itself to serve as the grassroots outreach arm of the campaign. And what we did some things that we cannot do this year with COVID. We organized people to hand out flyers at train stations and bus stops and so on, but also some things that we can do at COVID and have really accelerated. For that measure in 2018, we had over 100 volunteers. We reached tens of thousands of voters. And at the end of the day, actually at the end of a couple of very suspenseful weeks, Measure W passed by 500 votes. And the work that the grassroots groups did in reaching out to those voters really contributed to that very slim margin of victory. So when Measure RR got on the ballot this year, what we did was work with some of the same partners to take that same approach. And so Friends of CalTrain is working with partners, including the Silicon Valley Bicycle Coalition, the San Francisco Bicycle Coalition, San Francisco Transit Riders, a whole network of environmental groups around the region and others, and are marshaling a set of housing advocacy organizations as well, since it will be extremely difficult to meet the region's housing goals without having a functioning and improving public transportation system. So all of these groups worked with their member and participant bases. We've had over 300 volunteers so far. We've reached well over 100,000 voters through text banking and over 10,000 voters through phone banking. We're working with these different partners to get the word out via social media. There's an amazing climate youth movement that has really, sprung up and grown over the last couple of years that are getting the word out through Instagram. And we have several high schools that have sponsored their own phone banks, as well as college students. The youth movement has been a really important a piece of these and piece of this. And so with all of this, we are collaborating with the campaign, which the official campaign is led by the Silicon Valley Leadership Group, that is bringing in funding from the business community to do television advertising and mailers, and so that broad voter outreach that is not what the grassroots does. And then we've been working to marshal the volunteers to do that direct voter outreach that will be the last percent or so that will hopefully push this over the edge. Let's see, were there any other topics that I should touch on in the presentation before we open this up to questions?
Yeah, I think we can, if that's it, we can go ahead and transition over to Q&A. As a reminder, folks, you can submit your questions on the control panel on the side of your screen. And so we'll go ahead and get started with a few that are starting to trickle in. We had one question about kind of broader funding, not necessarily related to the measure, but a curiosity over whether there have been any plans or proposals in the long term to institute congestion pricing along the corridor, regardless of how the measure pans out.
Yeah, there is a project to install tolling infrastructure on Highway 101, which pretty much parallels the CalTrain corridor, and to have that toll reflect the congestion and increase and decrease according to congestion on the highway. There are larger discussions about congestion pricing in some of our most congested downtown areas at the bookends of the CalTrain corridor in San Jose and in San Francisco, but those are still in the early stages. But I think cities generally are looking at that as a more viable potential funding source for transit improvements in the future, because Adina rattled off two other sales tax measures that have already been approved, and we're talking about another one here. I think everybody's really keyed in on the regressive nature of sales tax as a funding source. Fortunately, with this CalTrain measure, what we've pointed to leading up to it being put on the ballot is that CalTrain shutting down is probably the most regressive thing that can happen for the peninsula from a transit and mobility standpoint. So we've been able to get past that. But congestion pricing is certainly something that's on the horizon, I think, in a lot of people's minds.
And we also had a couple of questions. I know Adina talked through some of the coalitions and some of the advocacy around the measure. And I know some people are curious to know, have there been any differences you've noticed in the coalitions or the kind of community sentiment around this measure compared to past initiatives, and whether the timing of this during a presidential election year has made a difference? There's been definitely a long history of ballot measures in the region, and I think people are curious to see how those coalitions have evolved.
So there's really been, in terms of the coalition, a lot of similarity, both building on the work we've done at the county level and also building on some recent work that's been going on over the last couple of years. The Bay Area as a region had been talking about doing a regional ballot measure for public transportation, and that major initiative was put on pause due to COVID, but there's a stronger and tighter network of advocacy due to that. So I think that has a lot of similarity. There was another piece to the question about there was a coalition, and then there's another piece to that question. Remind me of what that was.
The timing about whether past measures have also been during election years, or if this is a new.
Right. Yes. So a couple of interesting differences. One difference there is something that we're starting to see in the polling, where as around the country, there is a ton of early voting, and the early voting this time is really skewing positive. At least according to the poll results, the early voting is skewing positive, which was actually different from Measure W, where that in that 2-week period, the early votes were actually down, and then the late votes were positive for Measure W, and the early votes are positive here. Another difference that we're getting is actually in the questions, because so Measure RR does not have any organized opposition at all, but there are questions that people ask, and one of the questions that people ask is, well, because of the pandemic, are we going to see people coming back to using public transit? It's a question that's pretty easy to answer based on the information that CalTrain has from its riders, saying that the strong majority of them are planning to return, and the strong support from the business community that is seeing this as really essential to their continued economic success and economic recovery. So that's an interesting piece of the environment that is a question people raise that has good answers.
And on that point too, mentioned that there hasn't been a organized opposition to the measure. I think going back to the initial planning phases of the measure, and the boards were still before the measure was approved and referred to voters. Were there any, in terms of sentiment or in the community engagement process, people are interested in hearing kind of how those negotiations went, and whether the pandemic, increased support for the measure, or whether there were some tension points during those negotiations before the measure was actually approved.
Yeah, I think the way that CalTrain is structured with member agencies that don't necessarily have CalTrain as their #1 transit priority, let alone their #1 priority, period. The process that we went through and some of the conversation that happened sort of reflected that. We did have a hard enough time even pre-pandemic making CalTrain obvious as a priority for all 3 counties that it serves. The pandemic really shifted priorities even more to other issues that obviously need a lot of care and attention. One of the things that we really had to stress as a part of this effort to put this measure on the ballot is that there were some larger conversations around governance of CalTrain that were already bubbling below the surface, and really were a main topic of conversation over the last year that needed to really be fast forwarded in order to get everybody comfortable and to a place where this measure could be put on the ballot. And so that conversation had to happen in really rapidly, along with the discussion about what we would be doing with this measure should it pass, with the funds should it pass. So doing those things, having those 2 discussions concurrently as a part of a 7-agency process to put this measure on the ballot in the middle of a pandemic when we're all doing this on Zoom was a real challenge. And I think Adina would agree that there were times when we weren't sure if we were going to be able to get this done. And now that it is done, we'll see next week what happens.
Yeah. And I'll just add a little bit to that, which is that as part of CalTrain's business plan, there was a section that was on the governance of CalTrain. And one thing that section of CalTrain's business plan assessment showed is that CalTrain has been the most cost-effectively managed service of its kind in the United States. There's places around the world that outperform anything in the U.S., but CalTrain was really top tier in the U.S. But that report also found that in order for CalTrain to achieve the goals that the board was setting out for it, that change was going to be needed. In terms of the debate and discussion on that, a few different things, and there are certainly interests in having potentially more local control over the piece parts of the CalTrain system as an advocacy organization. Friends of CalTrain, and then the other group that I'm the advocacy director of, Seamus Bay Area, believes that the focus of upgrading how CalTrain is run to achieve the goals that it has in the future needs to focus on the shared goals of being able to achieve that vision in the CalTrain business plan, including the goals of having CalTrain service be better integrated as part of a regionally integrated public transportation system that is accessible to a more diverse range of people. And that kind of integration is something that CalTrain cannot do alone. So at a regional level, there need to be some changes to make it easier to have service integration from the perspective of transit riders. The Bay Area has 27 public transportation agencies, and that makes providing a seamless customer experience a challenge. So we think that there do need to be improvements for the region as a whole and for CalTrain, and we are very thrilled that those needs are recognized but not blocking getting this essential measure on the ballot, because like having the Bay Area as a region lose the West Bay spine of its regional public transportation network would really be a, kind of insane thing. And we need to keep that running and then improve CalTrain specifically, the region in general. And then one of the important things that it does for its member partners is that this funding would relieve SFMTA, San Francisco, San Mateo, and Santa Clara counties of the need to every year fund CalTrain operations, which in this recessionary period is, a relief for those partner agencies. So that's some additional context on that question.
Got it. And we'll come back to the the regional focus and talks of a regional measure in a minute. But we had a couple of clarification questions. One of them, one of the viewers are interested in about whether the revenue from the measures is primarily intended to be directed and subsidize operating costs, or whether there will be capital improvements and expenditures covered by the revenue.
Yeah, so it's both. The way that the Joint Powers Agreement is structured for CalTrain says that our member agencies contribute to make up whatever difference in funding, whatever subsidy is required after all other funding has been taken into account that's available. So under a scenario where Measure RR passes, there wouldn't be any need for member agency contributions to cover the operating and capital budgets that CalTrain has on an annual basis. Where member agencies will still need to come in and help is the funding that we'll need for the capital expansion program that will need to happen in order for CalTrain to increase its service levels. So there's about $1 billion need to realize that capital expansion. 300 million of it is left over after the operating needs of the system are covered on an annual basis. 300 million will be left over to go towards that $1 billion in capital need. There's 700 million that still needs to be made up by the member agencies. So $233 million per member agency over a period of time will cover that cost, and will leverage other state and federal funding sources that are also going towards that overall capital expansion.
And similarly, kind of on that point about service and system improvements, we had a question about whether CalMod and the electrification improvements have been able to continue throughout the pandemic, or have they been put on hold over the past couple of months?
No, they're continuing, and in fact, we have, because of our service adjustments, we have some larger work windows to complete that work in. The electrification project is really one of the most difficult things about it, is that we're building that project while we're operating the railroad at the same time. Not an easy task, lots of logistical complexities, but creating those larger work windows gives those crews more time to do more work. So we've been trying to maximize that as much as we can. That project is still advancing, and we're on pace to have it complete in 2022.
Got it. And we had another question. I know we were just briefly talking about discussions about governance, and we had a question asking to clarify whether the ballot measure or any of the negotiations around the measure impacted or changed anything about the governance structure, or if those are just separate discussions.
Yeah, they were. I mean, the discussions certainly weren't separate. They were happening, at the same time that we were having discussions about putting the measure on the ballot. The ballot measure itself doesn't do anything from a governance standpoint. All it does is provides CalTrain with the resources that it needs to survive the pandemic and then expand to meet the region's needs moving forward. That governance conversation started before this ballot measure was put on the ballot. It is going to continue, and the board made it clear with the CalTrain Board of Directors made it clear with a resolution that they passed that there are some timelines when certain governance decisions will need to be made, and we're working towards those timelines now. And one of the key considerations is what governance model and management model should CalTrain use moving forward to best deliver the long-term service vision that the board of directors has directed us to advance. How does CalTrain need to be resourced? What is the best management structure to be able to realize the full potential of this corridor and of this system for its riders?
Got it. And so, spending our final couple of minutes going back to the discussion about, regional initiatives and, pushes for a wider regional measure in the future. I know there were some people interested in how those discussions panned out, whether there were any plans to have something on the ballot this year prior to the pandemic, and what the prospects for, a larger regional initiative look like post 2020?
Yeah, so right now, with the pandemic impact on public transportation, around the country and in the Bay Area, which is really, pretty dramatic and bad, there is in the immediate term, first of all, looking at the national election, where different outcomes of the national election could have different outcomes in general for public transportation, and for the federal government is the entity that has the ability to do the most for the tremendous short-term impacts on public transportation around the country of COVID. There's work going on right now also at a regional level to figure out what kinds of resources. So the same attention that will go towards a regional measure is right now going towards wanting to make sure that we secure federal funding as much as possible, and then also to be able to leverage any regional resources and state resources that we can take to keep the public transportation system as a whole going. And then beyond that, I would expect renewed attention towards regional funding for public transportation, with a broad set of stakeholders supporting and an active debate around, some questions about funding mechanisms, and also a broad interest on improving the public transportation regionally. Seamus, is there anything that you would add to that summary?
I mean, I think just related to that, one of the silver linings of the pandemic is that transit operators are really collaborating in an effective way, probably in an unprecedented way, to make sure that our services are truly complementary, that we're minimizing any gaps between systems. We've collaborated to launch a healthy transit plan for the Bay Area that provides a common set of baseline measures that every system is going to take to protect our riders and our workers from virus transmission on our systems during this time. There are some service integration processes, procedures, and probably some venues for making service decisions that are being created during this time, so that we can have better integrated services during recovery, and I think that will lead to more service coordination when we emerge from this crisis. And that's something that we know Bay Area voters have said that they're interested in when they were having conversations about a regional measure before the pandemic, and it's something that we all expect that they will continue to be interested in if they're going to contribute any additional financial resources to a larger regional funding measure in the future.
Right, that is definitely true. That came up in the polling pre-COVID, and it came out extremely strongly in work that the regional planning that had done over the summer during COVID, where having a seamless system is something at the very top of what the public wants to see, and will be, like, putting that foundation in place will be important in getting that public support to fund a system that they believe is going to deliver good service.
Well, that is a fantastic stopping point. We will all be watching the results closely. and we will be out with some analysis once we know the results, however long that may take. Thank you again so much to Seamus and Adina for joining us. We appreciate your insights and your context on this measure. Thank you to all of you for tuning in. As usual, you can find our upcoming webinars at enotrans.org under our events tab. And thank you again for joining us, and we hope everyone takes care and stays safe.
Thank you very much.
All right.